You see, the Fallout 3 official game guide confirms that he only shot at you because he thought you were a slaver. He's actually a vigilante who lays traps for slavers. So basically, Linnaeus is just some guy who may or may not have done some bad stuff in the past, but some of it was probably someone else who was just wearing the same hat. And as for talking him down, at least in Fallout 3 it vaguely makes sense in context. Because while we generally don't like saying this out loud, New Vegas' hardcore mode isn't actually that great.
So, I don't really agree with Miniature Nerd's video, Fallout 3 is better than you think. The video is a response to a more critical look at Fallout 3 in videos like Fallout 3 is garbage. Fallout 3 and garbage, in turn, was a response to a largely uncritical reception by video game reviewers like IGN. Fallout 3 is better than you think is, more specifically, meant to be a response to the criticisms of Fallout 3 is garbage, the shandification of Fallout, and why Fallout isn't Fallout, but draws on criticisms more from the general discourse than any specific critic. While I'll be referring a lot to Miniature Nerd and talking about pervasive aspects of his critical approach, I don't mean this as any kind of attack on him. He made a video responding to criticism of Fallout 3, and as I found myself disagreeing with almost every argument he made, I've decided to make this in response to Fallout 3 is better than you think. I'd like to use Miniature Nerd's video as a springboard to discuss my own thoughts on Fallout 3 and what made the early Fallouts so great by comparison. I'm also not going to be countering all of Miniature Nerd's arguments either, because honestly, a lot of them don't really need a response to be debunked. As a general example of this, despite Fallout 3 is better than you think being made as a response to videos critical of Fallout 3, for a number of his arguments, you can almost look at the critical videos as responding to Miniature Nerd's points, despite being made before Fallout 3 is better, and Fallout 3 is better being made in response to them. As some examples...
Beyond that, there's a science check you can skip if you choose to thoroughly search the rooms as well. Fallout 3's message here is clear: explore thoroughly and you'll find alternative solutions, which again seems to be exactly what people claim that they want out of a Fallout game.
To access the Overseer's computer, you could do the hacking minigame, or you could open the drawer directly next to the computer and obtain the password directly. While this is probably done to teach the player that hacking and lockpicking are useful but can sometimes be circumvented by resourcefulness and being aware of your environment, they impart the far stupider lesson that hacking and lockpicking is pointless and you'll be able to skip them incredibly easily. So players are ingrained with the belief that these minigames can be avoided and you ought to look for ways to do so.
What, for example, is the optimal way to get to Vault 112 and Smith Casey's garage? How does the game want you to get there? Because the road near Vault 101 doesn't go that way, it veers north, and the largest road south is a raised freeway you can't access. The simple fact is, Fallout 3 doesn't have a route it wants you to follow. Fallout 3 doesn't think like that. Fallout 3 is just an open space.
And down here is the biggest travesty in the history of video games. Okay, it's not that bad, but it's pretty bad. A good game can tell you where to go effortlessly through the design of its levels, or by giving you enough directions that you can put the pieces together yourself. This is good because it encourages the player to be aware of their surroundings, which lets them fully appreciate the worlds the designers have built and all the neat personal touches to it. When you build a world centered around giving them a blip on their radar to walk towards in a straight line, you hamstring not just their own sense of going on their own journey and making their own decisions, but you've created a situation where the game is teaching you to follow this with your brain. Your eyes are trained to follow it, to stare at it, to just go where it tells you to.
This is something that Fallout 3 innovated, and it did stick around into New Vegas and Fallout 4, and quite rightly too. The radio. Not just for inventing the idea of juxtaposing jaunty 50s music with creeping around a raider base in some dark ruins, which perfectly suited the classic Fallout trend of mixing sometimes goofy humour with moments of utter darkness.
Then there's use of oldies music in the Fallout games. Old Fallout only played 1950s style songs during a pre-war video or during the intro. Afterward, it wouldn't be referenced again. Humming to Bob Crosby while firing nukes at super mutants in New Fallout was pretty funny the first time you did it, but it dilutes the game's atmosphere, making it charming and quaint, like a GTA Mad Max edition of sorts.
I'm as corny as Kansas in August. I'm as normal as blueberry pie. No more a smart little girl with no heart. I have found me a wonderful guy.
So, yeah. I nonetheless recommend watching Fallout 3 is Better Than You Think, so as it's clear I'm not misrepresenting any of Miniature Nerd's arguments. But, like I said, while my aim is in part to discuss some of my critical disagreements with Fallout 3 is Better, and by extent Fallout 3, I also want to talk more precisely about what made New Vegas and the early Fallouts great by comparison, and maybe even open up this mysterious toolbox. I had a section where I was reading this out loud, but then I rewrote it, so this is just a still frame, I guess. And to do all that, I need to travel the length of this beach and perform the forbidden ritual at the Great Bonfire. Before we begin talking about Fallout 3 proper, I'd like to take a moment and explain part of what seems to be Miniature Nerd's analytical perspective on authorial intent. Which is to say, Fallout 3 is Better has a sizable auteur theory undercurrent to it. Auteur theory is, to mangle its meaning, to look at art as an extension of its creator, its author, its auteur. Fallout 3 is Better version of auteur theory is, you can't criticize Fallout 3 because Bethesda's an artist with intentions. This perspective isn't outright stated, and I apologize if I'm just completely misreading the arguments, but it seems to be the missing logical leap which is underpinning a couple of Miniature Nerd's otherwise most confusing arguments. The most notable involving the Brotherhood of Steel. We'll be talking more fully about the Brotherhood later on, but this part of his defense really shows off this aspect of his analysis. Miniature Nerd argues that while Bethesda's Brotherhood has been criticized for not being like the Brotherhood of past Fallouts, they're not like the Brotherhoods of past Fallouts intentionally. There is evidence, he claims, that Bethesda was aware they were changing the Brotherhood. Miniature Nerd points to the Outcasts as proving that Bethesda knew they were changing the Brotherhood, because the Outcasts are meant to be more like the original Brotherhood, which shows that they knew that their Brotherhood was different from the original. And by showing that Bethesda knew they were changing their Brotherhood, it means the changes were intentional, which means Fallout 3 defended from criticism? The missing link, as I understand it, is that Miniature Nerd is here trying to say Bethesda's authorial intent to change the Brotherhood inherently justifies the way they've changed the Brotherhood, which it doesn't. It's obvious that Bethesda made choices about the Brotherhood, but that doesn't excuse their choices from being challenged and criticized. Bethesda's Brotherhood is a less interesting, less endearing, and a generally worse written Brotherhood. To unpack Miniature Nerd's argument a bit more, the Outcasts actually work against his auteurist view of Fallout 3. If, ideologically, the Outcasts are the ones who haven't changed, then why are they the ones who have to change their armor and name? It looks like Bethesda wanted to make their version of the Brotherhood, but were too worried about losing brand recognition. So they made an entirely new faction in order for them to be the old faction. The integrity of Bethesda's vision of a new Brotherhood is self-evidently corrupted by Bethesda's own reliance on the Brotherhood of Steel as part of the Fallout brand. I mean, imagine a version of Fallout 3 where these guys were called the Outcasts and these guys were called the Brotherhood. Wouldn't that just make more sense for what they're trying to do? Fallout 3 is Better Than You Think begins by discussing Fallout 3's first segment of gameplay, which apparently is not you as a baby, but you at the birthday party. Now, according to many a true nerd, what the devs choose to tutorialize first is what they think the core mechanics are. Which apparently means that Fallout 3 prioritizes dialogue and non-violent solutions, because it's definitely the first thing you do in the game. Whereas in Fallout 1, you're just fighting rats. Talk about an over-reliance on combat. Many a true nerd believes that we should ignore the long, tedious baby scene before the birthday party because it's also the scene where you pick your stats, which somehow makes it not part of the game, of course. So to respond to this, it's important to explain how this weird framework of criticism has conceptual problems. The idea of a story starting out with its most important themes or aspects isn't at all a bad idea in itself. I'd say a lot of good stories do this. But it isn't some universal aspect of stories. It's as if you had a setup in a story, but then no payoff. You couldn't then go around saying there must be a payoff that everyone's not appreciating because there was a setup, because sometimes there is no payoff. Miniature Nerd is looking at the openings in such an overly mechanistic way so he can say how theoretically much the authors care about dialogue rather than actually looking at how the authors use dialogue and choice in the games proper. Looking at Fallout 1 is a prime example of how flawed this overly mechanistic form of criticism is. In Fallout 1, you start in the Rat Cave, so therefore it must think that combat is super important. But once you get into each game proper, Fallout 1 uses combat rather sparingly, whereas Fallout 3 has it everywhere. It seems like making a big show of caring is more important than actually caring. I mean, they even let you specifically spare one of the guards on your murder spree escapism. How thoughtful. They must really care. On a more meta level, Miniature Nerd is trying to say, Fallout 1's opening is kinda bad, so don't criticize Fallout 3. But without any substantial criticism to say why it's bad, aside from that maybe the designers thought combat was important, and just being too mealy-mouthed to say that Fallout 1's opening sucks. By the way, Fallout 1's opening sucks. You know, H-Bomber Guy from Fallout 3's Garbage can soliloquize over Fallout 1's map design all he wants, and later I'll be doing the same. But you know what Fallout 1's opening isn't? Inviting. As someone who was born after the original Fallout games were made, playing them just felt awkward. Movement just felt a bit too slow and jittery, combat felt gawky, and what was up with all these point-and-click mechanics? It feels like a point-and-click adventure game, but mutated into something new and unfamiliar. It even has the verbs. It's quite disorientating. It also isn't until you reach the hub, the third town, and about a fourth of the way through the game that you really get a sense of what the world is like. You might think you know what the world is like after Shady Sands, Return to an early agricultural society. But then you get to Junktown and it's totally different visually and socially. So which is the world like now? You can't really tell until you reach the hub. It isn't until the hub that you have enough data points to really understand the status quo of the world, which again just adds to the disorientation. These sorts of things you don't really notice if you're replaying the game. I mean, once you get how the world works and how all the systems work, it's a breeze, but to a new modern player who probably just wants to get into the original Fallouts, which everyone says are so good, these obtuse mechanics and structure will make it feel like you're struggling through a swamp to make any progress. It's not really the Soulsian get good so much as get acclimated. I think that Fallout 1's opening has probably alienated a lot of newer Fallout fans who just wanted to get into the old games but found them too esoteric and decided it just wasn't their cup of tea. Fallout 2's opening, on the other hand, is a much better introduction to the early Fallouts. It's a much more direct tutorial in the form of the Temple of Trials and its opening towns, which maybe isn't very fun on your 4th playthrough, but is much better for a new player. Tutorials have a bit of a reputation for being a bit overly straightforward, but the old Fallouts can feel so arcane and alien to a new player that, honestly, having something as familiar and straightforward as, "This is the Trial Temple," is welcome. To use a term by H-Bomber Fallout 2 has better play conditioning. Its opening conditions you how to play the early Fallout games far better than Fallout 1's opening does. If you're a modern Fallout fan looking to get in on the old games, play Fallout 2's opening before even touching Fallout 1, and maybe watch a bit of a playthrough by someone who knows what they're doing. Original Fallout designers Tim Kaine and Leonard Boyarsky played through the first part of Fallout 1 for an Obsidian Extra Life stream, and it's sort of the director's commentary track for Fallout 1. It's an insightful and useful playthrough, learning about how the game was made and some of the design elements that went into it. I highly recommend checking it out.
Now, if I remember, the reason we did this is we wanted you to learn combat.
Yeah, but, I mean, it's so funny how little thought went into some of the stuff we did.
Huge amounts of thought went into it.
To fans of Fallout 1 and 2 who think I might be being a bit harsh on these masterpiece games,
Who designed this monstrosity of a game?
I am, because these are masterpieces. When H-Bomber said that these were virtually some of the best games ever, that's not hyperbole. Getting used to the mechanics can feel like a swamp, but once you're used to it, all the pixely artwork, all the jittery movements, it all washes away and you feel like you're really in the world, on an adventure, and it's amazing. I just think that the opening of Fallout 1 probably turned off a lot of people which could have found it amazing too. A quick side note on the topic of weird mechanics and that sense of alienation, design-wise, it can actually be quite useful. In the original Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, it evokes the same kind of technological and storytelling disorientation, but uses it to create a sense of intrigue and mystery, as both you and your character are surreptitiously tossed into this confusing and complicated urban fantasy world. Who are these characters? What are these factions? What are these graphics? Is this how you use a gun? I just wanted to say that this disorientation can be well used, but in Fallout's case, I just found it to be a detractor. Then again, my version of Bloodlines seems to have come with the male gaze mod already installed, and I still haven't found a way to uninstall it. Returning to Fallout 3's opening, one of Miniature Nerd's core points is that people say that there isn't enough options in the tutorial, but there are plenty of options. Doesn't really take into consideration how unengaging the scenarios and characters are. While Miniature Nerd belabors the great pedigree of the sweet roll dilemma, the sweet roll is boring. Butch is boring. Amata is boring. Your father is boring. Calling them tired cliches would be a compliment that they don't deserve. As another example, Miniature Nerd looks at all the ways you can resolve Butch bullying Amata. Here's an option. Here's an option. Why are people complaining that there are no options? This of course ignores the context of Amata herself. The game literally saddles you with Amata and says, "This is your best friend because we said so," and then just expects you to magically develop attachment for them. You get involved not because Amata is someone you actually care about or that bullying is in general wrong, but because the game seems to put it in your path like an obstacle, like it expects you to just deal with it. Why would anyone want to explore all the options for how to save Amata when the game's created no emotional attachment for her or this entire problem? And you have a tantalizing speech check right there. Most of what makes Fallout 3's opening so bad can just be boiled down to Bethesda's bad writing. Vault 101 is where Bethesda has the most creative control over the player's experience, and they only show how badly they use that control. The next question which May a True Nerd poses is that why do people complain about the escape sequence just being a hallway filled with enemies to shoot, when you can just run and sneak past them all? I.e. the sort of thing you do if you're just trying to skip through the game's bad enemy corridor rather than engage with it. In particular, May a True Nerd points to this first guard and the Brad Roaches as easily run pastable, completely ignoring the context. The game hands you a gun, puts an enemy in front of you, even distracts them, and we all remember what the solution last time this happened. You can't blame players for engaging with the game as the game has conditioned them to. But at the end of this tutorial, we're finally able to escape from this monotony and leave. Apparently, leaving the vault is meant to be this astounding, exciting moment where the world opens up to you. I remember the first time I left Vault 101. I came out of the vault feeling cooped up and frustrated. I had just been through a vortex of unengaging characters, enemy hallways, and mind-numbingly poor writing. Coming out of the vault, all I could do was glare at the sun and think, about time. I had no sense of wonder, only a deep hole where my patience used to be. My first Fallout game was Fallout New Vegas, but when I played Fallout 3, I had a reason to think it was good. I had a reason to be excited to play Fallout 3 in particular. I thought it had to have been good. When I left the vault and thought, about time, it was because I still trusted it to be good, even after that disastrous opening. I kept playing, asking the game, when was it going to get good? When was it? Was it the main quest? Was it the world? Was it Broken Steel? When would it rise beyond the vapid, empty shell of a game that it was? And it never did. It never got any better. So ends the intro of Against Fallout 3. Against Fallout 3 is better than you think. What is Many a True Nerd's unironically best defense of Fallout 3 comes when Many a True Nerd is discussing Little Lamplight, specifically how he defends Bethesda's choice not to include child murder. For those not in the know, because Fallout 3 is a decade old, there was a controversy about Fallout 3 not having child murder because the older Fallouts did have child murder. Vic, why? Many a True Nerd explains that for a big budget game like Fallout 3, including child murder would be extremely bad optics, which I totally agree is a valid reason not to include it. It's a pretty silly thing to get upset about. But it's also not the greatest idea to remove this well-known feature of Fallout and to then create an entire town of children. To make Child Town directly part of the main quest. To have your first interaction with Child Town to be with a child jerk. And to specifically cultivate an unimmersed, blow a town up if you like style of play throughout your whole game, all of which would lead to players trying to shoot the children. This makes me suspect that the designers did actually intend for there to be child murder, likely for the aforementioned reason they decided not to include it. Except they still left in all the parts which would still lead the player to attack the children. Bethesda may have been justified in not including child murder, but they also designed the perfect scenario where the lack of child murder would be the most obtrusive, and where fans would be the most pissed about the lack of child murder, of all things. Bethesda, how do you even do this? Meanwhile, in New Vegas, which was made by Obsidian, it also doesn't have child murder, but also children mostly exist in the background and don't play major roles in the story, so the lack of child murder doesn't really come up. That's not good. Is he seeing me? In any discussion of a world in a Fallout game, we inevitably come to the term shandification. The term's history begins with the video The Shandification of Fallout by Mr. Beatung. And if you're at all interested in what I have to say about shandification, I suggest going out to check out the original video because it'll explain it far better than me. But I'll give a general summary of the term nonetheless. Hello, this is me when editing. In a plot twist no one could have seen coming, the shandification of Fallout has been blocked by none other than the National Basketball Association. So, this is possibly the best explanation of shandification you might get, unfortunately. Shandification is the description of a particular kind of storytelling inspired specifically by the tale of Tristram Shandy, wherein the story structure focuses more on a larger scale of story than is typical. That is to say, instead of looking at the final straw which broke the camel's back, a shandified story might examine what forces and stories led to straws needing to be put on a camel's back. Where did these straws come from? And the prior back history of the camel in question. Now, the life history of one camel and the production of these straws on their own would seem to be very disparate elements, but of course, knowing the full context of it, it all makes perfect sense as to why they're related. But let's say we expand the scope and begin going into detail for the reasons for those reasons, and we'll soon find ourselves with quite a complicated web. And exploring this web in a meandering yet still grounded way is what makes a story shandified. Mr. Beatung makes the point that video games make for innately good vehicles to tell shandified stories because the player is able to explore this web of reasons at their own leisure. They can come to a place and ask, as Mr. Beatung does, what do they eat? A game which is well shandified like the early Fallouts and New Vegas can answer this question easily because they've put consideration into what these people eat. While games which aren't well shandified like Fallout 3 will just kind of blankly stare back at you. A bit like if you had opened a big poofy pillow cushion only to find that there wasn't actually any stuffing, just an empty, hollow abyss inside your pillow, and the abyss is just staring back at you in a kind of existential, awkward silence. Mr. Beatung asks, what does Megaton eat? What does Rivet City eat? What do the super mutants eat? And the game doesn't really give any satisfactory answer to any of these questions. In Fallout 3 is Better, shandification is described as...
You see, there's an old video from about 5 years ago that discusses Fallout 3 in New Vegas called The Shandification of Fallout, which basically discusses how games work better if their basic logistics have been thought through and it's obvious how basic human needs are being met.
And responds accordingly to this grossly oversimplified understanding. Because of this, Mini True Nerd only responds to the symptoms of Fallout 3's endemically poor shandification. Also, he only tries to dispute one of Mr. Beatung's 3 examples, Megaton, as if that was the only badly shandified place which was brought up. So, after all this preamble, what does Mini True Nerd actually say? Well, that Megaton is well shandified because there's mole rats outside the town, which must mean they eat them.
So in the case of Megaton, the city has food because the one upside of the apocalypse is that wildlife is massive now, and there are plenty of mole rats right by the side of the town.
Which is pretty clearly an idea pulled out from thin air, Because at no point in Fallout 3 is it discussed or implied where Megaton gets its food at all. The only evidence to this idea is that you can find 3 or 4 mole rats outside Megaton. Fallout 3 in no way communicates that, apparently, these 3 or 4 mole rats are Megaton's sole food source. No one says, I hunt mole rats. No one says, we eat only mole rats. No one says, please don't kill the mole rats for Moira's book or we'll all starve. There's no evidence that these mole rats are a food source for Megaton. Miniature Nerd is just trying to use spurious connections to pave over the lack of evidence for things which the developers just didn't care about. Oh yeah, also Megaton is built around a nuclear bomb? I don't think I mentioned that. And weirder yet, Miniature Nerd just seems to think that this is normal and sane? Fallout 3 flat out doesn't care about believable or even understandable world building. But there is one more thing worth mentioning about Fallout 3's towns, which Miniature Nerd brings up later. That they are pretty neat looking. Despite the monotonous colors, they are very aesthetically well designed. In their own way, they're beautiful. And you know what they say about beauty? It's only skin deep. Despite the title of this part, it's altogether much more to do with map design, even if it's also about story, which is why I put it here instead of the story section later on. One of Fallout 3's better's most surreally bad points comes during an examination of the main stories of Fallout 3 and New Vegas in how they take the player around the game world through their main story, fast traveling when convenient. Notice how the New Vegas map organically takes you to almost every part of the world and feels like a big, complete journey. Whereas in Fallout 3, you don't, and it looks awkward and pitiful by comparison. It's impressive because it just so clearly illustrates how much more care and thought was put into making New Vegas's world and main quest work in tandem compared to Fallout 3. And it's impressive that Miniature Nerd tries to argue it the other way. Miniature Nerd made these maps, and they really clearly work against Fallout 3's favor. And yet, he still included these maps in his video anyway. I don't know why. To try and cover up the clear disparity between the two maps that he made, he begins by adding on side quests and also unlisted quests even, stating that we need to be more generous with Fallout 3. And oh wow! Once you've got Fallout 3's side quests, unlisted quests, and main quest, it actually looks to have comparable content to just New Vegas' main quest. Checkmate, New Vegas fans! The justification Miniature Nerd gives is that Fallout 3 has a decentralized narrative, which apparently makes Fallout 3 beyond comparison to the other Fallout games' stories. And this decentralized narrative is what we're here to talk about. What a decentralized narrative means, he describes as something with not just one quest, but with a lot of separate little quests. Though, to extrapolate from even this vague definition, Miniature Nerd's claim of Fallout 3 being a decentralized narrative would still be incorrect, because a decentralized narrative would presumably still have a narrative it wants to tell. For it to be a decentralized narrative, all these little quests and main quests would actually need to be in service of telling a cohesive story, and not just be a jumble of unrelated filler side quests with no thematic or world-building relation to one another. You can't just group them together and call them a decentralized narrative if there is no narrative. What makes this worse is that the early Fallouts and New Vegas obviously do tell a narrative through their side quests and main quests. Take Fallout 1, which barely has a main story at all, being more a conglomerate of side quests for most of the game. Each of the town stories aren't related to the other towns, but they all have similar motifs of intergroup conflict. Groups who have been torn apart, towns which are tearing themselves apart. And at the end of it, you have the Master with unity, the solution to a humanity which can't stop fighting itself. I'm going over Fallout 1 because its concept is the most abstract, and Fallout 2 and New Vegas' narratives of racism and war are honestly really obvious. Every town and almost every quest in New Vegas relates to the whole story of the NCR Legion narrative. Take for instance part of the small side quest High Times, when you ask the drug dealer why he's so intent on selling drugs and alcohol to Jacob Hoff and Bill Ronte. He says this:
"Those fools are from NCR. I love seeing those squatters in agony. We were doing just fine before those shits came here and made a mess of things. We don't need NCR eggheads wandering around confusing things."
This minor side quest is as much a part of the Mojave's story as Benny or Lanius. The only reason why New Vegas doesn't also meet Miniature Nerd's vague criteria for what a decentralized narrative is seemingly because Miniature Nerd doesn't want it to be. Let's tackle two different arguments that Miniature Nerd makes in one, because they both center on narration. Firstly, if New Vegas is such a good game, then why doesn't it have post-game roaming instead of boring narration, which would allow us to see the impact of our choices firsthand? But secondly, and more importantly, New Vegas' opening narration has exposition. Dun dun dun. So, let's explain why exposition isn't bad and why post-game roaming in New Vegas is nonsense. To go over the latter point first, Miniature Nerd's reasoning is that New Vegas' opening narration has exposition, and that narration which informs you about stuff is bad, because it's...
That is just a massive exposition dump. That is pure telling, not showing.
Unlike all other narration. It's funny that when complaining about completely telling, not showing, he doesn't mention the opening cinematic, which shows the entire complicated setting first before telling. They're kind of odd, that. But to explain what leads him to his point, the argument is that in Fallout 1's story, you learn about the world gradually. You don't learn about the mutants until sometime around the midpoint. Overall, this structure is very satisfying, learning more about the world as you go. Therefore, he concludes, New Vegas is bad because it shows and informs you about the Legion right away. Because Fallout 1's narrative structure is the only true Fallout structure there is. And ooh, look at Fallout 3 for introducing its antagonist late, like Fallout 1. Because apparently, we can only understand good storytelling as a checklist. Now, there's a bit of a hole in Miniature Nerd's point here. You know, about introducing antagonists right away being antithetical to Fallout. But to really discuss the flaws in this idea, we need to look at why this change might have happened. In Fallout 1, the mutants are a very mysterious force. You only meet them about halfway into the game. They're powerful, important, and you know nothing about them. This is, though, a double-edged sword. The mutants feel mysterious and intriguing, but they don't really feel a threat to this. They have an ideology and immense power, but compared to the urban mundanity of, say, Junktown, the mutants feel like they exist in some sort of separate cartoon world outside the down-to-earth real world of traders and farmers you've been dealing with up to that point. They feel like a mysterious force, almost from another world, but they're also a threat without any real grounding in the narrative when they're introduced. In Fallout 2, they seem to have noticed this storytelling flaw and remedied it nicely. The Enclave are all over the early game. They're in cutscenes, they're mentioned secretively. You see little glimpses of them. You're well aware of them from the start, but they're still mysterious. More so even because they're all over the place, but you still don't know anything. By introducing the player to the Enclave from the beginning, it makes them feel like a much more organic part of the world than the super mutants were. That said, both the Enclave and the super mutants suffer from evil alien syndrome. You blow up the mothership and the alien threat disappears, and everything is status quo. Like saving the world didn't even matter in the long run. This means that Fallout 2 can't naturally just let the player wander around after blowing up the Enclave without needing to change it that much. But it does weaken the narrative, I feel. Which brings us to New Vegas and Caesar's Legion. The conflict between Caesar's Legion and the NCR is baked into every one of the towns and major factions of New Vegas from the beginning. I mean, guess where all the powder gangers came from? From the tutorial area of Good Springs onwards, you can begin getting people's opinions on the NCR and Caesar's Legion, and you'll keep getting new viewpoints throughout the whole game. Trudy understands the NCR's flaws, but believes they bring safety, whereas Sunny Smiles has a real unspoken resentment towards the NCR, and thinks that the Legion using slavery might just be a rumor drummed up by the NCR. In a way, you could have Fallout 1, but without the super mutants. And you could have Fallout 2 without the Enclave. But you couldn't have New Vegas without the Legion and NCR. Caesar's Legion is the most radical, dangerous, and most alien threat there is in the world of Fallout. One which can't just be conveniently blown up. So, considering how the conflict of the NCR and Legion is so ingrained into the setting of the Mojave, giving a little history establishing the Mojave isn't a bad idea, while still giving room to expand upon going forward. Miniature Nerd acts like just because you're given some basic information at the start, that's all the information at once, and that there's nothing left to learn about the world. But obviously that's not the case. There's Bitter Springs, there's the Brotherhood NCR War, the history of Caesar himself. There's a history for why things are the way they are. And these histories aren't isolated, unrelated lore modules.
Don't kill me, please. I'm going.
You see, the Fallout 3 official game guide confirms that he only shot at you because he thought you were a slaver. He's actually a vigilante who lays traps for slavers.
But all interconnected parts of the same tapestry. Given how the whole setting of the Mojave is predicated on the gridlock conflict between NCR, Legion, and House, any side winning the Battle of Hoover Dam would drastically change the entire setting. The workload of reimagining all of the Mojave under Legion control, or without the presence of the Legion at all, would be like making an entire additional game. Actually, 4 different games. And if they tried to shirk the workload to cut down on the ramifications, it would undercut the importance of the entire Hoover Dam conflict. If a post-game Mojave remained the same, it would ruin the entire point of New Vegas. But if the game did go on to fully reimagine the setting, with all the possible consequences, then the workload would be impossible. This is all to say that New Vegas' ending narration is the best ending. And looky here, you can continue right from the save before the final battle. A much better alternative than post-game roaming. As an example of how post-game roaming would ruin New Vegas, look no further than Fallout 3's Broken Steel. The importance of Fallout 3's conflict is based on the importance of the water purifier. That this purifier will change the wasteland, that it's of giant robot, kill yourselves level of importance. And In Broken Steel, you can continue after the Purifier and see how much it's actually changed the wasteland. See how important it really was. The fruits of your labor are 3 more side quests. The Water Purifier and Fallout 3's main story as a whole is rendered completely inconsequential to the unchanging wasteland. Maybe this is unnecessary, but if you weren't satisfied for the more conceptual defense of why basic exposition in New Vegas' opening narration isn't bad, I'd also like to offer a more technical counterpoint and talk about how great the early Fallout's map design was. Don't tell anyone, but actually I wrote this entire section just to talk about how great the early Fallout's maps were. Shh. The original Fallout's map design does allow the player to explore anywhere they like from the start. But because every bit of unexplored map is an empty void filled with nothingness and scorpions, it discourages mindless exploration. You want to uncover more, but if you just decide to wander off in a random direction, you'll find yourself ganked to death by scorpions, geckos, and plants. This allows the designers to have a good deal of control as to where you're going to go when, by controlling what information you can get where. Like a trail of breadcrumbs. In a first-person game, though, you can't really disencourage players not to just wander off aimlessly without a plan, so designers have to plan around that, as they did in Fallout New Vegas. The shortcuts across the mountains could allow a new player to accidentally skip Nipton and the entire introduction of the Legion. These shortcuts are designed to be found. There are breadcrumb paths of curiosity that will take you right to them. If it's possible for a new player to unintentionally skip past a ton of the main story, then you still have to make sure that they have the basic info they need to make choices. Like a bit of narration. This point is honestly just another small straw on the camel's back of ill thought out points in Fallout 3 is better. Wait, is the camel the ill thought points or the back of the camel the ill thought points? Or this straw is an important emblem of a repetitive flaw in Fallout 3 is better. The name of this straw emblem point is damage. Near the end of Fallout 3 is better, Miniature Nerd makes some criticism of the early Fallouts and New Vegas' armor system compared to Fallout 3. In early Fallouts and New Vegas, armor had a stat called Damage Threshold, which reduced incoming damage by a specific amount. Miniature Nerd points out that once the player has gotten the late game power armor, raiders and most creatures aren't much of a threat. And while New Vegas only allowed for up to 80% of the damage to be blocked, the problem still persisted. This, he claims, led to uninteresting and one-sided battles in New Vegas. Whereas in Fallout 3, Damage Threshold was replaced with Damage Resistance, which reduced damage by a certain percentage, and sometimes had stat modifications, which, according to Miniature Nerd, made armor choices more interesting. So let's begin picking this apart. I'll get stat modifications out of the way first. The stat bonuses for armor were often so insignificant that unless you needed something specific, like rad resistance, it's really hard to grasp what, say, +5 medicine or +1 to agility would really do. The stat mods were never really substantial enough to really impact armor choice. The damage resistance system was also rather unintuitive in how much it mattered. I mean, like, how much really does 5% more armor resistance do? But at least you knew that bigger numbers were better at least. But moving on to damage. Miniature Nerd is correct that once you've gotten power armor, raiders and scorpions aren't a threat. But by the time you've gotten power armor, you're not really fighting those things anymore. You'll be fighting super mutants and nightkin and other terrifying monstrosities. In context, power armor is appropriately powerful. Manitou Nerd plays footage of his level 18 New Vegas character wearing combat armor and fighting enemies made for a level 2 or 3 character, which apparently proves his point about damage threshold being a broken system. Actually, checking the armor listings on the Fallout wiki, I'm not even sure what kind of combat armor this is, but it's certainly nothing you'd find around Goodsprings or Prim. However, Miniature Nerd has also run the numbers to see how much damage the average dog bite does in Fallout 1, New Vegas, and Fallout 3 when wearing basic leather armor. In Fallout 1, it's about 2.25. In New Vegas, it's 6. And in Fallout 3, it's 9. As would seem self-evident, Fallout 3's armor and damage system was clearly, it would seem, tough, hardcore, and merciless, whereas Fallout 1's armor system was totally easy. But there is just one or two little issues. Firstly, how much health does the player have? In New Vegas and Fallout 3, it's 200 at level 1. In Fallout 1, it's 30. Maybe this is something which should have been mentioned. Secondly, how many times in a given round or space of time would the dog attack you? Now, given the difference in combat mechanics, real-time versus turn-based, this would also have a notable impact. Thirdly, you don't fight dogs in Fallout 1! Miniature Nerd, what are you talking about? Yes, there's dog meat, but you don't fight him. Dogs, as an enemy, wouldn't appear until Fallout 2, wherein they came in big groups, each could attack multiple times per turn, and despite their seemingly low damage, could easily surround and kill you. Despite appearing to be the weakest version of dogs in Fallout, the dogs in Fallout 2 are probably the most dangerous when you consider them in the full context. What I'm trying to point out here with these examples is that Miniature Nerd is intentionally or unintentionally leaving out key and obvious pieces of information in order to fabricate criticism. Power armor was overpowered. If you ignored what it was you were fighting in power armor, Fallout 1's dogs were underpowered enemies. If you ignore how many you fight at once, and that you don't fight dogs in Fallout 1. When numerous systems all interact with one another, you can't just draw a tiny circle around one or two of them. You have to consider how all these systems interact in tandem. You can't just look on the wiki and see all the games have dogs and come to the conclusion that dogs are the ideal difficulty measuring stick, because the games all use dogs in different ways. I'm not even sure where you'd find dogs in New Vegas. And we don't even have time to get into how much healing has changed between the early Fallouts and the modern ones. Fallout 3's biggest gameplay problem is specifically the way that it uses combat makes it more of a shooter game than a role-playing game. The combat in Fallout 3 on its own, to me, isn't that bad. It's not exactly good either, but it's passable enough. I'm sure people who like and understand shooters and all of the nuances could say more, but I don't, so I'll just leave it as passable. The issue which emerges is just how often you have to engage in combat. Whenever you want to go somewhere, some random encounter will attack you. Whenever you want to explore some cool place, I hope you like dungeons filled with enemies. Whenever you just want to do a quest, well, more often than not, that still means more combat. Fallout 3's combat is passable in isolation, but when combat is what you're doing almost all the time, passable doesn't cut it. Combat begins to stop feeling enjoyable and more just like a chore you have to do before you do anything else. Fallout 3's over-reliance on combat also weakens the believability of Fallout 3's world as well. Yes, I get that the Wasteland is meant to be brutal, violent, and a place where people fight and die a lot, but at a certain point you wonder how there are even this many people to shoot. How has there been this much fighting and dying for 200 years? How has this been sustainable? Where are all these raiders coming from? It doesn't feel like a harsh and realistic wasteland. It feels like a cartoony action movie wasteland, where enemies just exist for you to shoot them. This leads to other problems as well, one which Mei True Nerd has identified and called a survival element. In discussing Fallout New Vegas' hardcore mode, Mei True Nerd describes Fallout 3's ammunition as akin to a hunger or thirst meter. Automatic weapons, in particular the Chinese assault rifle, are very effective in Fallout 3, except because you often fight things which don't have guns, or which attack you with different kinds of guns, you don't always recoup your losses. But really this isn't some unique mechanic, it's just a shooter mechanic. When you run low on ammo for one gun, you switch to a new gun. When you're running low on ammo for the Chinese assault rifle, you switch over to the combat shotgun, then maybe the SMG or the scoped 44, and then it's back to the assault rifle. And because you fight so much, which ammo you have is always in flux, so you end up just carrying around a bunch of different guns, which leads us to the problem of weapon variety. Because while you have a bunch of variety in your personal arsenal, shotguns, assault rifles, what have you, you always end up with the same personal arsenal. Most characters end up using the Chinese assault rifle no matter who they're meant to be. The gun-ho mercenary, sure, Chinese assault rifle. The suave gentleman, Chinese assault rifle. The meek nerd, Chinese assault rifle again. This shifts the feeling of Fallout 3 away from making a unique character and more like you're just gathering shooter guns. Weapons can be used as a reflection of the characters using them. Take for instance the companion weapons in New Vegas. It's very appropriate that a very friendly character like Veronica uses a very close-range weapon like the Power Fist, and a very standoffish character like Boone uses a sniper rifle. Or take Caesar's Displacer Glove, which is a high-tech weapon reflecting Caesar's academic nature, but also an unarmed weapon, adding a paradoxical hint of savagery, which reflects how it is that Caesar's used his knowledge to create the Legion. And New Vegas also lets the player be able to express themselves with their weapons too, both because it has more variety in similar weapons, and by simply not bombarding you with enemies whenever you want to do anything. Because you're not fighting as many enemies, the amount of ammo you have doesn't fluctuate a lot. And even if you are running low, with no shops that will sell the ammo you need, there's ammo crafting, which means that you can consistently use the weapons that you want to use, and which best fit your character. But then again the question arises, what about the early Fallout games? In the early Fallouts, guns feel largely the same. Every character is also going to use the same pistol, and it often feels like you're just leveling up to a better version of gun than you are uniquely developing a character. And while I think this criticism of the early Fallouts would be fair, it also doesn't matter very much. Your character in early Fallout games are less defined by their combat because you don't do that much combat, at least by comparison. The early Fallout games have the least combat of all the Fallout games, often using them at the climax of the quest rather than just to pad a quest out. The criticism which probably most illustrates the difference between Mei True Nerd and my own understanding of immersion and role-playing is his statement,
because while we generally don't like saying this out loud, New Vegas' hardcore mode isn't actually that great.
He complains that including hunger and thirst bars, which are easily satiated by plentiful resources, just slows the game down. He cites Fallout 4 as having a better survival mode because its design is, in some unnamed way, superior. What all this shows is that me, a true nerd, seemingly doesn't understand immersion like I do. An important aspect of role-playing games is immersion. The illusion that you really are in a desert and that really is a giant scorpion coming right for you. New Vegas' hardcore mode isn't actually that hard. Rather, it significantly strengthens this sense of immersion by changing many of the game's mechanics in ways which disadvantage the player slightly, but make you feel much more immersed. And these changes strengthen many of the base game's already great immersion features, like foraging. Throughout the game, you'll find tons of banana yucca fruits and rock flowers, and you'll always want to pick them up because they barely weigh anything at all and are free healing. You feel rewarded for your awareness and immersion in the game world. And in hardcore mode, guess what? All those banana yucca fruits now heal your hunger and thirst too. So you'll feel more immersed and aware of your surroundings, not just because you'll have to eat and sleep like you're really there, but because the other mechanics, which you'll use to solve your new problems, like foraging for food, will strengthen your immersion as well. The best example of New Vegas' stellar immersive design you encounter right along the road from Good Springs to Prim. This ditch. The best way past the ditch is to go around it, avoiding the radioactive trash at the bottom. If you did this, then I'm terribly sorry, but you have failed the puzzle. Let's look at this ditch as if we were really in the Mojave Wasteland. What is this ditch? Well, from the curved and cracked appearance, it looks like a dried up riverbed. But if this is a dried up riverbed, then where's the source? So you follow the riverbed up into the mountains, fight some geckos maybe, and wow, we found the source and there's a ton of rock flowers, which we've recently learned we can make into healing powder. The way in which New Vegas' world, items, and systems all work together to reward you for immersion is amazing. As a quick comparison to Fallout 4, the plants you find are radioactive, so whenever you eat them, you're reminded that you're actively poisoning yourself. And now, that radiation is on your main HUD, so you can reminisce about the time you poisoned yourself by trying to engage in the game world. Gee, I sure want to engage with these mechanics and be immersed in the game world now. Fallout 4's hardcore mechanics mainly just makes the game more punishing than immersive. It's like using a hammer to pound in a screw. Returning to Fallout 3, its bad writing is also systemically antagonistic to both role-playing and immersion. For immersion, this is much more of what we've already talked about, from unengaging characters, poorly thought through world building, and generally using splashy violence as a crutch to keep players engaged. In terms of role-playing, the general binary of Fallout 3's morality system, giving you mainly bland black or white or neutral choices, only really allows you to define yourself as a hero guy or a supervillain guy. There's nothing with even half the nuance of New Vegas' Prim, where each potential sheriff's downsides are clear and present a nuanced question as to what the player and their character values in independence, in justice, and in practicality. The overarching story structure of Fallout 3 also limits the player's expression and agency, mainly by railroading. Railroading, a tabletop RPG concept, is, to use the Urban Dictionary definition, the act of forcing players to choose to do something they don't really want to do in order to advance the plot according to the wishes or designs of the GM. Thus, the player is made to feel like they're being moved through the world or plot as if they were on train tracks without any choice of where to go. Fallout 3's story doesn't give you choices as to who you want to side with or what narrative things you want to be doing. You'll always be going down the same rigid track. But to fully discuss role-playing and immersion in Fallout 3, while it's important to look at these aspects directly in Fallout 3, it's also important to look at what kind of commentary Fallout 3 seems to make about immersion and role-playing. In particular, the Superhuman Gambit and Tranquility Lane in the context of a role-playing and immersion reading. Fallout 3 does have a lot to say about immersion, role-playing, and even later on, race. It's just that when you ask, what is this trying to say to Fallout 3, you don't always get a nice answer. For instance, Fallout 3 doesn't just do a bad job at immersion, it's full-on actively hostile to the idea of role-playing in general. In the unavoidable part of the main story, Tranquility Lane, the two ways out of the simulation are to kill all the residents and they'll come back in some later simulation to get killed again, or end it all and kill them for realsies. This is kinda a deep choice in a completely contrived and artificial sort of way, except this is ignoring how it is the game executes this choice. The real mechanical choice is between, look at all the wacky ways you can kill this woman! I'm wearing a clown mask and chasing people with a knife, Elmao! Or, random Chinese soldiers XD LOL. The real message of Tranquility Lane appears to be that the people in this virtual world, i.e. Fallout 3's world, don't matter. Kill them with a knife, kill them with a gun, you'll reset the virtual simulation and nothing will ever have any consequences. For Fallout 3, the morality of this choice is set dressing. Fallout 3's take on role-playing is also quite blatantly negative in a very direct way. In the quest The Superhuman Gambit, Fallout 3 squarely says that the people who are role-playing as their characters are annoying, destructive to society, and need to be stopped. In Fallout 3, the post-nuclear role-playing game, the people who are expressly role-playing are weirdos who are the problem. The position which Fallout 3 wants its players to be in is unengaged with the world, unengaged with actually playing a character, and playing for the amusement of shooting people with junk and blowing up towns for shits and giggles. Fallout 3 wants a player base of murder hobos. The term murder hobo also comes from the tabletop RPG world. To quote the Wiktionary definition, murder hobo, role-playing games derogatory slang. A player who wanders in the game world unattached to any community, indiscriminately killing and looting. In short, the ideal character to play as in Fallout 3. There is, of course, a common rebuttal, I anticipate, to this kind of criticism, which is worth getting out of the way now. The argument goes something like this, that I, the critic, am reading too far into these quests, which are just meant to be dumb fun, expecting these writers to have actually considered what messages their works might have is an unfair standard. Have I, the critic, even seen their work? It's juvenile garbage. In short, I am being unreasonable to look for messages in things which the writers were clearly too incompetent to include intentionally. Now, this rebuttal of Fallout 3 just being empty fun doesn't do it any favors, but also ignores validity of concepts like death of the author. To look at a work for what it is, detached from whatever empty fun the author intended. To argue whether or not the artist specifically intended the message to be there does nothing to the message which is still there for all to see. Keep this counterpoint in mind when we get to examining Fallout 3's take on race. Miniature Nerd splits his criticism of Fallout 3 into two camps, dialogue and plot. We'll begin with dialogue, or as Miniature Nerd calls it, writing. To refute the claim that Fallout 3 has bad dialogue, He provides 3 examples of apparently good writing in Fallout 3.
In all the commotion, Miss Beatrice suffered a rather bad sprain in her left toe. The big one. Obviously, I had no choice but to amputate the leg. Yeah, I'm sorry to say the operation was not a success.
I even stitched a little smiley face in you to keep up your spirits. It's kind of hard to see from your side, though.
This is a sad day. A day that every man, woman, and child will remember as they toil in the English salt mines as slaves.
So, these are the highlights. These are the examples that are meant to wow us, to reverse our opinions completely. The best that Fallout 3 has to offer are some mediocre jokes. Miniature Nerd acts like these are indisputable proof of Fallout 3's genius writing.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not having that. Fallout 3's got some great writing and some amazing voice acting to go with it.
But they're not. They're so-so jokes, and it feels a bit telling that the best bits that he can find in Fallout 3's writing aren't any emotional scenes or eloquent speeches, but just some mediocre jokes. Throwaway jokes aren't a bad thing, they're fine. But this is the best writing in a Fallout game? Many a true nerd pretends that Fallout 3's reputation for bad writing only comes from a few specific examples. But these are not why Fallout 3 as a whole is considered badly written. It is the thorough lack of any truly good writing from which Fallout 3 earns this reputation. The points which demand the most detail. The points when the player is paying the most attention. These points are left barren. The problem is not isolated instances, but the drowning, gagging quicksand that is this pervasive, below-average mediocrity. The parts which are worst are not notable because they are so much worse, but because there is no patience left for them. But oh, Miniature Nerd has some criticism of Fallout New Vegas' writing. Miniature Nerd feels that this line from an optional sex dialogue with Benny isn't very well written at all.
Because New Vegas has some very dubious moments as well.
Nice Charlies, too. Give him a shake for the Ben man, will you? Hello.
Seriously, to this day I'm amazed they actually let Matthew Perry leave the recording booth if that was the best take.
Wow. What a stirring argument. Is there a player alive who hasn't maligned this optional piece of sex dialogue? Then there is the plot, and here Miniature Nerd tries to respond to some criticism from Fallout 3 as garbage. He leads into this response by comparing the plots of New Vegas and Fallout 3, the initial parts both focusing on hunting down one specific person, while being introduced to the world around you. Both so mechanically similar, how then could two things so similar in superficialities be so fundamentally different? What a conundrum. It is this conundrum which brings him to Fallout 3 as garbage.
To revisit H-Bomber Guy's well-known critique, he dislikes how you move around the game world, running into major players and factions as you go, walking from clue to clue, the overarching story boiling down to, and I quote, "You're still following this one guy's trail." Again, I find this an odd criticism because I've never seen anyone hate on New Vegas' first act, even though it's pretty much exactly the same.
Now, I'd like to play the section of Fallout 3 as garbage that Miniature Nerd is talking about, but go a bit further.
And then you go there and blah blah blah, you're still following this one fucking guy's trail. Which brings me to the game's biggest single narrative and gameplay problem. The main character is never the main character.
Do you catch that last bit?
Which brings me to the game's biggest single narrative and gameplay problem. The main character is never the main character.
H-Bomber Guy's point isn't that Fallout 3 is bad because you're following someone. His point is that Fallout 3 focuses so heavily on your father's narrative, it's at the expense of the player's own narrative. Benny, by contrast, is rarely the focus while you're following him, and by doing so, New Vegas doesn't try and put the player in his shadow. The player is deciding sheriffs and negotiating hostages. The story is about them. Many a true nerd only makes the superficial comparison between Fallout 3 and New Vegas without fully examining the more fundamental approaches to storytelling which H. Bomber Guy is criticizing. But there is a third part of dialogue which we have to consider when dealing with interactive stories, and that is what choices of dialogue the player is presented with. You could have the best written jokes, but if you don't have the question the player wants to ask, then it's all for nothing. This has a lot more to do with the shantification of the world. It's the ability to ask, what does Menegaton eat? Is the question of how a society of children can exist for 200 years with no parents. It is the question of where all the rich people in Tenpenny Tower even made their money. And it is these sorts of questions which are left pointedly unanswered. Miniature Nerd proclaims,
if Fallout 3 has a thesis, it's perhaps a warning against clinging to the past, repeating old mistakes.
And I feel that this is a valid reading. But I feel that Fallout 3 does also seem to promote the exact opposite as well. The main story of Fallout 3 is all about your father trying to restart his failed purifier. And Fallout 3 depicts you and your father killing yourselves to protect the purifier as a heroic sacrifice. Is Fallout 3 trying to say, move on from the past, while also idolizing killing yourself and others over a past which had failed? Now, I don't want to just be dunking on Miniature Nerd's personal interpretation here. I'm just trying to say that it needs a bit more flesh on it before it can really be taken seriously. But it's to Fallout 3's benefit that it's not all about this theme of moving on, just because of how disingenuous it would be in context. Trying to send the message of moving on from the past while regressing from all the changes made between Fallout 1 and 2. Caps are replaced with an actual currency, but Bethesda brought them back. City-states have formed, but Bethesda wants everything to be ruins. The age of vaults is over. Not in Fallout 3. Bethesda just can't let go of this juvenile, homeostatic wasteland with the mutants, the caps, and the war never changes. Things couldn't really change, could they? Except things did. The world of Fallout grew up, but Bethesda couldn't or wouldn't. In the meta-narrative of Fallout, Bethesda's Fallout 3 is the enclave of Fallout 2. In the same way, the regressive obsession of the Enclave with pre-war America stands in contrast to the actual progress of mainland's new America. Fallout 3's obsession with the wasteland of Fallout 1 stands in contrast to the progress of Fallout 2. Thankfully, there is also New Vegas. New Vegas does continue the story of Fallout 2, making this theme of change even more explicit with old Doc Mitchell. He's a vault dweller, symbolic of re-emergent civilization, who is now old and retired. While he had his days of wandering, they're long over now, and he passes the metaphorical torch, the Pip-Boy, onto a generation born into this new world, the Courier, unambiguously saying that the world has moved on from vault dwellers. Yet Bethesda still hasn't. It's tragic in a very meta way. To bring this section around to some criticism by Miniature Nerd, he makes an odd jab at New Vegas, claiming that it's not a real post-apocalyptic story like Fallout 3, but just a poser post-apocalypse story. I mean, how can we take all this cowboy stuff seriously when it's not even trying to be vapidly edgy? I'd like to end this bit by saying, if New Vegas is a post-apocalypse story, then it's only the natural conclusion of a process started in the original Fallouts. And I think that makes it cooler. Yeah. I just stuck my tongue out. I don't think that's going to come across. Before discussing the Brotherhood of Steel in Fallout 3, we will of course need to understand many true nerds' defense of it first. Apparently, all the maligning of the Brotherhood in Fallout 3 is from them being made into good guys, but maligning them just for being good guys now is bad. Now, let's take a look back at one of the critiques that many a true nerd is meant to be responding to. Fallout 3 is garbage.
No, they can be any way the writer wants them to. They could not even be in a Fallout game because they all died. They could be 6 guys holding on after the end of their whole way of life. They could be exactly the sort of group they are in Fallout 3. But whatever they are, they have to be done well. None of the Brotherhood are given sufficient levels of characterization or writing or relatability. You never really understand these people.
Another perspective, but I'm sure that many a true nerd responds to the actual quality of the changes somewhere. No? Alright. Many a true nerd, for whatever reason, doesn't even mention this sort of criticism, let alone respond to it. So it's not like I even really need to talk about the Brotherhood. This criticism still stands. Many a true nerd defends the Brotherhood in concept, but simply doesn't address the quality of that concept's execution. But I am going to talk about the Brotherhood because I think that just having the Brotherhood but now redeemed was a conceptually bad choice, simply for the narrative structure that Fallout 3 was going for. In the first game, the Brotherhood's story was more internal. As isolationists, they were divided as to whether the mutant threat was grave enough for them to get involved. The answer to this was yes. In the second game, the Brotherhood's issue was more external. They were once the strongest faction in the Wasteland, but no longer. Could they regain their former position of power? The answer to this was not yes. The biggest narrative problem with the Brotherhood in Fallout 3 is that they play an even bigger narrative part than they ever did in the old games, but they don't actually have any particular issue they need to overcome. They seem to be beating the super mutants just fine. They actually don't have any trouble at all fighting the Enclave. They don't have any substantial problems or nuance, and always win. The Brotherhood is made less interesting and given more focus, compounding the problem. Bethesda disregarded the story of the Brotherhood and took away all the complexity they had and gave them nothing but a power fantasy robot in return. It wasn't that the Brotherhood being the goodies was an inherently bad idea, it's that it was Bethesda's only idea. They were bound to be as clumsily executed as they are. There is also many true nerds' second argument for the Brotherhood, that as the Brotherhood's main theme is their isolation, and that the Brotherhood of Fallout 3 technically still discusses this isolation, the complaints about the Brotherhood's changes are overblown. That, at the end of Fallout 1, the Brotherhood seems to be pretty similar to how they seem in Fallout 3. Similar would be the key descriptor here, though. The Brotherhood seems the same, but only at a surface level. Beneath, though, they've been oversimplified and streamlined into a parody of what they once were. In Fallout 1, the Brotherhood didn't overcome their isolationist nature to oppose the super mutants because they were a threat to the common people. They were happy enough to just wait it out in their bunker. The Brotherhood opposed them because the super mutants were a big enough threat to be a threat to the Brotherhood. Similarly, in Fallout 2, the Brotherhood is still just looking out for the Brotherhood and their mission. What's in their best interest just so happens to line up with what everyone else's is too. Looking at Fallout New Vegas and the Brotherhood and NCR's falling out, it seems to explore what happens when eventually the Brotherhood's interest and everyone else's interests don't so much mesh. But not so in Fallout 3. The Brotherhood's now entirely reoriented around protecting people and calling them civilian for the sake of it. They really have been simplified down to just being the good guys who shoot the bad guys. The marketable and juvenile icon of the Brotherhood as the big good guy soldiers mattered more to Bethesda than what the Brotherhood actually were. There's one detail which best shows the way in which Bethesda's taken only the surface elements of the Brotherhood and left all the richness of their character behind. It's this one bit of dialogue from this one female knight, and her saying how it isn't the Sisterhood of Steel.
Damn right it is. Last time I checked, it wasn't called the Sisterhood of Steel. Hell, even Sarah has to prove herself to the knuckle draggers. Every once in a while, we have to show them what's what.
It paints the Brotherhood as having a kind of cookie-cutter, army macho guy misogyny, but it hit me like a ton of bricks while I was replaying Fallout 3 after playing Fallout 1. In Fallout 1, when you finally get into the Brotherhood, you can talk to this run-of-the-mill female knight and ask her why it is that everyone calls female knights brothers. And to her, it's just natural that they call everyone brother. She's never thought that it was weird at all. It was just tradition. To the Brotherhood of Fallout 1, every member was a brother. So, when in Fallout 3, this character says, "It's not like this is the Sisterhood of Steel," it shows that who the Brotherhood were has been lost. I'd like to give some dialogue from another Fallout title to show just how well written the Brotherhood can be when they're given actual effort. We do not pretend that we are building a society now. We are just gathering what is necessary for those who will. The Brotherhood will wait out this plague, and when you debased creatures which call yourselves people have finally extinguished each other, generations from now, the Brotherhood will emerge into a world clean of you. We will rise like a phoenix from the ashes, a pure and true one, bringing with us all the glory and knowledge of the past to create a new world of proper people. And you can probably guess where this quote is from. In Fallout 3 is Garbage, H. Bomber Guy uses the tutorial vault as a way to discuss Fallout 3's wider problems with its morality system. But I feel that 3Dog, the embodiment of Fallout 3's messed up moral system, makes for a better example to examine Fallout 3's moral problems. 3Dog represents the moral voice of the wasteland, his in-game critiques of the player mirroring the player's karma system. And so by understanding who 3Dog is, we can better come to understand the moral perspective that the developers want the players to have when playing Fallout 3.
People of the Capital Wasteland, you can hear me! Yee-haw! You can't stop the signal, baby! The look on your face says it all. You're wondering who the heck this guy is and why you should care. Well, prepare to be enlightened.
3Dog is youthful, obnoxiously loud, and self-assured in his moral perspectives. There is the good fight and the bad guys. It's all just that simple. He poses himself as the in-touch DJ who knows the advice the common people of the wasteland need to hear. From his radio broadcast and from his dialogue, this is seemingly who the creators want 3Dog to be. But how 3Dog and the developers want to see him as is not in the context of Fallout 3's world what 3Dog actually is. 3Dog doesn't spend his days scavenging for food. He lives in a secure bunker with Brotherhood Knights as his bodyguards. He is so secure that not even a super mutant behemoth can touch him. When 3Dog poses himself as a common man of the wasteland, he's posing himself as part of a community which he's entirely isolated from, which only emphasizes the real problem. That 3Dog's perspective doesn't feel like someone who's lived in the wasteland, someone who's had to make tough choices in order to survive, but just the shallowest mirror of our own 21st century perspective. 3Dog pretends to be a DJ in tune with the wasteland, when his perspective is that of a privileged, morally imperialistic annoyance who lives in an impregnable ivory tower. He's also a manipulative hypocrite. When you finally meet him and just want him to tell you where your dad is, he won't, unless he can profit off of it in some way.
So I'd like to share, I really would. But if I help you and you just leave me hanging, I would have failed the fight. And that can't happen, dig?
The worst part is that neither Three Dog or Bethesda seem to have any self-awareness of this. Three Dog is a 2D flaccid character with no real past, no real self-awareness, and no more personality beyond his loud, obnoxious, self-centered radio persona. Three Dog is the voice of Fallout 3's morality, and he doesn't need to change his black and white juvenile perspective, because the world he inhabits is actually that juvenilely black and white. Remember when I said, keep this in mind for when we talk about race? Well, let's talk about what messages Fallout 3 has about racism. Who's ready for some good old-fashioned post-nuclear fantasy racism? So, let's begin with the super mutants and ask a couple of questions. How are they presented? And how does Miniature Nerd say that this presentation is actually very nuanced, but no one appreciates it? The super mutants are depicted as big, unintelligent, and bloodthirsty monsters with guns. This is not a particular new observation. The weird thing about this depiction is that in the original games, the super mutants might have been big and green, but not bloodthirsty. If you talk to Harry, a super mutant soldier in Fallout 1, he's not hanging out with gore bags. He isn't even hostile. All he really is interested in is doing what he was ordered to. Now, maybe this might have something to do with the in-between Fallout games, which I've never played, but to go from Fallout 2, whose whole underlying theme is that everyone of every radioactive fantasy race is worthy of personhood, to super mutants are rage-fueled monsters who keep gore bags, is a shift. For the early Fallouts and New Vegas, a super mutant was no less deserving of a person's inalienable rights than a human was. Fallout 3 doesn't see the mutants as people. To Fallout 3, they are just the enemies. Then there's Fox, the fantasy race equivalent of I'm not like all the other girls, a two-dimensional Disney character defined by how much they're not the presumed stereotype, but in doing so, enforcing that stereotype. Because while they're the exception to the stereotype, all the rest definitely are the stereotype. So, to move on to the next question, how does Miniature Nerd try and say that it's all really deep, but no one's appreciating it? You see, Miniature Nerd has deciphered a meaning which no one else in a decade of Fallout's release has. It's meant to be a tragedy. In Fallout 1, they have a society and values, but in Fallout 3, they are an incomprehensible idiocracy with no clear culture aside from being orcs with gore bags. Isn't this change tragic? Now, I just don't feel that this reading has a lot of ground to stand on. If we're meant to be feeling all empathetic for the super mutants, then Fallout 3 should have done something to make them more empathetic. If we're meant to be thinking of the super mutants of Fallout 3 in the context of the super mutants of Fallout 1, then why isn't there any reference to Fallout 1's super mutants to help draw this parallel? If Fallout 3 wants us to have any meaningful understanding of the super mutants, then why are they so explicitly underdeveloped?
Would you believe no? It's pathetic, really, considering we've been fighting those abominations for nearly 20 years.
The tragic Great Society Brought Low reading doesn't fit here because the super mutants of Fallout 3 seemingly never had a great society, but were always rage monsters. Furthermore, Fallout 3 doesn't explore why it is their super mutants are so different from Fallout 1 or 2's mutants. They just are. The closest thing Miniature Nerd can point to is that Fallout 1 had the Master. And without a Master, this is what the super mutants would naturally be like.
Hurry up and die! I'm hungry!
Which doesn't sound so good with radioactive fantasy race allegory. But super mutants aren't the only race. We come now to Tenpenny Tower, a more generic, morally oversimplified, and overall less interesting version of Vault City from Fallout 2, but with a very different message. The conflict of this quest is that Tenpenny Tower is a very nice place to live, and a group of ghouls wants to live there. But the racists who already live there,
the correct genes,
don't want to let them in. Both groups, like sane and relatable people, think that murdering the other group is the best way to solve this dispute. But instead, the player can just speech check the Tenpenny Tower residents into not being racist. This, on its own, is a very oversimplistic idea of racism. All we need to do is get rid of the really bad racists, and then you can just desegregate, no problem. Everything's hunky-dory, racism solved forever. And that would be the good ending to this analysis. This shallowness actually seems to be intentional here for the real message, because when you do come back a couple of days later, the ghouls have killed all the humans. Desegregation, and then the desegregated group murders everyone in their sleep. So, it seems that the moral of this story is desegregation bad, don't trust minorities. I mean, really, what else are we meant to make of this? The story is blatantly saying, you think that once we let all the segregated people in, everything will be hunky-dory? Nuh-uh. If we desegregate, then they will kill us. The shallowness of the good ending seems to be mocking the idea that desegregation could turn out well at all. But to be the fun police on what seems to be a story written by a racist teenager trying to be edgy, that's not historically how desegregation tends to play out. You know, I'm pretty sure that the Little Rock Nine didn't call the National Guard to prevent the white kids from going to school. I also can't recall the time where Rosa Parks sat in the white section of the bus and then proceeded to slaughter every white person on the bus, steal their clothes, and then make a body pile in the back of the bus. Just wasn't in my US history class. Funny that. At last, though, there is the Enclave, or more specifically President Eden, the camouflage for all this fantasy racism. President Eden is racist. He wants to let loose a virus which will kill all the super mutant ghouls and mutated humans, or in other words, everyone. Eden is the image of racism which Fallout 3 presents. Racism is always obvious, so ridiculous that no one could really believe something like that unless they were intentionally choosing to be evil, and that this racism lies solely with the racist himself, and isn't, say, a systemic problem, that not even his second-in-command believes in his perspective. The game condemns this over-exaggerated, oversimplified token of racism, using it as a smokescreen, while nonetheless pushing segregation and stereotypes. Fallout 3 wants to look at Eden and just how racist he is, but not to look at Fallout 3 itself and question if maybe making one of their allegorical minority races into gore bag collectors wasn't also, a bit questionable. But in saying all of this, there is the instinct to extrapolate further than what I've said, to believe that I'm signing blame and derision. Am I, by saying that Fallout 3 has problematic racial themes, saying that everyone who likes Fallout 3 is a racist? Am I saying that everyone even remotely associated with Fallout 3 is a racist? Of course not. I'm saying that Fallout 3 has some problematic depictions of race and a juvenile understanding of racism, just in the same way that the original Bloodlines has a lot of objectifying portrayals of women. Gotta put the vampire titty right on the cover, don't you? I like the original Bloodlines, especially the ending, but it's not like I should ignore its problematic elements either. In looking at the problems of Fallout 3, this is a problematic part which should not be ignored. We're here now, almost at the end, and we've still got to talk about Fallout 3's ending. So, let's talk about that. While Miniature Nerd admits that he doesn't believe the ending is great, he nonetheless gives some defense of it, and is again responding to some criticism raised in Fallout 3 is Garbage. Fallout 3 is Garbage critiqued Autumn's poor writing, unclear motives, and how Autumn simply doesn't represent any overall problem in the wasteland like the other villains do. To which Miniature Nerd responds,
I mean, I don't even know what to say to that. Actually, wait, I do. At least Autumn actually showed up earlier in the game. At least we've seen him before. At least he's actually done something against me and against my family. At least some effort was made to show, not tell. Linnaeus is literally some guy who we've never met before the final confrontation.
which is a bunch of empty waffle. Spouting off at leasts and show not tells like some sort of magical words to ward off criticism, while never going into any detail as to how they impact the story. Autumn is such a flat and unmemorable character that after the first time he shows up, you've probably already forgotten he should have been dead. Autumn does stuff against your family, which you've never grown attached to. Then Autumn uses a magical Deus Ex stun grenade to capture you. The effort is all that Miniature Nerd can praise because the execution is awful. Meanwhile, you don't meet Lanius before the final battle, but you don't need to. From the moment Lanius speaks, you can tell that he's both a big deal and like nothing you've ever faced. An earlier introduction would have lessened the impact of his character. But Miniature Nerd doesn't think that Lanius is as well written as he's cracked up to be. Miniature Nerd complains that Lanius' exact backstory is inconsistent. His identity as Lanius is questionable, and that the reality doesn't seem to match the backstory. Lanius is, as Miniature Nerd summarizes it,
so basically Linnaeus is just some guy who may or may not have done some bad stuff in the past, but some of it was probably someone else who was just wearing the same hat. And as for talking him down, at least in Fallout 3 it vaguely makes sense in context.
Unpack meaning? Understand metaphor? Nope, it's just someone else in the same hat. A lot of Miniature Nerd's points have been flawed or misrepresentational, but this takes the cake. So let's unpack some of that meaning. Lanius' whole appearance, speech, presence is all explicitly meant to evoke the sense of a twisted mythological hero. That much is obvious for a faction based off the Romans. His differing backstories also fit into this persona, because, of course, myths don't just have one singular telling, but a ton of different tellings, which historians have to piece together. The dubiousness of Lanius' very identity plays into this historic theme, like in the same way the gulf of time muddles with locations and authors, like the true identity of Homer. So too has Lanius' identity been made malleable and then lost. His mask, in the context of a faction based around Rome, seems to be a reference to the masks worn in Greek and Roman plays, again connecting him to mythological stories. Yet, this is all looking at Lanius at face value, the persona of Lanius. But even still, it's clear how well these themes intermesh themselves with his design and dialogue and context. Going deeper, though, is Lanius really who he says to be? A point which Ulysses makes, and that Miniature Nerd brings up as confusing, is that Lanius might not be the original. The identity of this heroic character being nothing more than a mask. Lanius, the character, and then the actor who must maintain that character. The masks of Greco-Roman plays in this context even more closely tied to Lanius, symbolizing both Lanius' mythological status and the falsehood of that status. Except deeper, is that really the case? Is Lanius just meant to be an actor? Actors don't play their characters for their whole lives. They don't blind their slaves to keep the mystique of the stage alive. When you meet Lanius, there isn't any point that you see behind his role, like you would if he was meant to be some sort of actor. If we imagine actors like a coin, with one side as their role and one side as the actor, then Lanius would be a ball. He is his role from all angles. Lanius is who he represents, and what he represents is the persona of Lanius. Epitaph, Butcher of the East. Lanius is so obsessed with the concept of Lanius, he's literally wearing a cosplay of himself. Now, this is just my reading of Lanius, which I feel is well supported, but even if you have a different reading, I think it's obvious there's some meaning in a man who wears his own face as a mask. It's more complicated than just some guy wearing the same hat. Now that that's all out of the way, what was that last part of what Many True Nerds said? About how, at least in Fallout 3, it made sense in context? Let's dive a bit into that claim next, shall we? Many True Nerds says that Fallout 3's ending dialogue is way more believable, whereas New Vegas' ending dialogue doesn't make any sense at all.
But Linnaeus? A man who, according to his own slightly dubious backstory, was so obsessed with fighting that when his tribe tried to surrender, he turned on them and kept fighting beyond the point of mutilation? A man who Caesar specifically says has no love for the Legion and is just a butcher who is personally loyal to Caesar alone. He is going to back down when faced with the argument that California is a bit big, so it would stretch the Legion to hold it. Yeah, sorry, I'm not convinced he's the sort of guy who gets convinced it's better to play it safe than risk conquering too much.
Yeah, I'm sure that Lanius wouldn't care about saving face. But in all seriousness, Lanius is very clearly obsessed with preserving his own mythological status. Recall, if you will, when many a true nerd mentioned talking to Ulysses about Lanius. Something else which Ulysses talks about is how Lanius wouldn't destroy his own myth by fighting a losing battle. I don't mean to be pedantically bringing up some obscure quote.
You see, the Fallout 3 official game guide confirms,
but this is a part of his character which is shown just in his character design, and here it is being said directly. So this half of the argument doesn't hold much water. But what about the other half? It's time to talk about Autumn. While Autumn shows up earlier in the game and does mean stuff, what he does never comes across as things he's doing to the lone wanderer so much as what Fallout 3 is doing to the player. In your first encounter, you're not able to interact with the whole scene at all. The game taking narrative control completely out of the player's hands because now is the time for your father's heroic sacrifice. The next time is even worse, with Autumn capturing you in a cutscene. Autumn never comes across as a tangible villain because all that's happening is that Autumn is doing mean stuff, and the game is keeping you from doing anything about it. In Fallout 2, the Enclave did bad stuff also, but it was impersonal and with a motivating ideology behind all of it. Not some, I'm going to specifically target you specifically because you're the player. But to dig into the dialogue differences between Lanius and Autumn, we have to look rather closely at Autumn's dialogue with the player. For the final conversation with Autumn, it's easy to say that it's bad. Motivations are unspecific, ideologies are never fully defined, and the plans are overall vague at best. But when you really try and break down and understand what each side is saying to the other, it becomes utter nonsense. More on the player's side than Autumn's, though. The highlight, though, is when the Lone Wanderer says, more violence isn't going to solve anything. Which, sounds like a kind of cookie-cutter, good guy thing to say, except when you stop and consider that we're the ones who are attacking them. And that's not getting into the weird Daddy Eden loves me more sort of mind games which the player is doing in the other route. But the individual argument which the Lone Wanderer puts forward isn't what Miniature Nerd believes is what makes their position more convincing. Might makes right, and the Lone Wanderer has a bigger gun. Philosophy doesn't matter. Who's right and wrong doesn't matter. All that matters is that the player wants the purifier, and Autumn is in the way. As you walk down with Liberty Prime, your side is overwhelming, and the Enclave are weak. There are no ideals to overcome, only power that needs to be used. It's the black and white good guy, bad guy. To Fallout 3, it isn't about exploring questions of right and wrong. It's about feeling powerful for killing obvious bad guys. So, I know that to a lot of Fallout 3 fans, this'll just seem like an incoherent rant. Some new YouTuber making an obnoxious response video, insulting a game you like with trumped up charges of bad writing, bad world building, and racism. It feels like I'm making some personal attack on something you value, and also attacking a video which you may have rather liked. So I'm just gonna come out and say squarely how I feel. I don't like Fallout 3. And by now, I hope I've at least helped explain why I don't like it. And I also don't really like Fallout 3 is better. It feels like the arguments were just spammed out, the cadence is too fast to really absorb what's being said, and without title cards, the arguments just feel mushed together with too many tangents. But I don't begrudge Miniature Nerd for making it. He made a video trying to defend a game he likes, and I'm sure that there are things that he'd like to go back and change about the video as well. I know that there's a lot of things that I've changed about this video since I began. I even cut out a caravan duel. But, Miniature Nerd, if you're watching this, in trying to compare Fallout 3 so heavily to New Vegas and Fallout 1, you've missed out on what would be your strongest argument. That Fallout 3 should stand on its own unique merits, entirely separate from the other games. In the video Fallout 4 and Roleplaying by Aaron Signal, and the multiple videos on Fallout 4 by Noah Caldwell-Gervais, both of whom are excellent video essayists, both argue that Fallout 4 is best experienced as a kind of free-roaming power fantasy roller coaster-esque game, with a Fallout aesthetic. Looking at Fallout 4 in such a way, they found it to be a rather successful and fun game. Now, that's not the kind of game which appeals to me, but while I'm loath to say it, it would seem that in looking at Fallout 3 in such a way, you could make the point that Fallout 3 might be enjoyable in the same capacity. So yes, Fallout 3 is probably, likely, pretty good. If you're into that sort of thing, I guess. And yay, there is much rejoicing of Fallout 3 fans, for vicious fate, who had seemed to poison the pure and untainted thought of Fallout 3 by means of this foul internet guy, had indeed lent it salve, and in layering had expanded Fallout 3's inherent bounty. Verily, there was much merriment made upon the grassy meadows, for in such Edenic fervor was innocence preserved and cruel reality thwarted. Such was their Bacchus joy and frolicking that the pan pipes were played until break of morn. Meanwhile, what are we meant to do? The fans of old Fallout. Are the Fallouts which had brilliant writing meant to be nothing more than historic texts, succeeded by their vapid descendants? Are the Bethesda Fallouts to be the legacy of Fallout? Yes, there is the Outer Worlds and other successors, but in time, will the name Fallout no longer raise memories of the Master or the Legion, but only of the number 76? For those of us who don't like Fallout 3, what is there left of Fallout? Well, I think I might have something which could be of interest. I've mentioned that Fallout New Vegas was my first Fallout game, but it wasn't my first Fallout title. You know, some people who already don't like this video may take what I'm about to say and go, we can just dismiss this guy's arguments. He's clearly irrational because he likes that thing. Some other people who have liked this video may go, oh, I liked the video up until he started talking about that weird thing. There is also a third group of people who have picked up on the foreshadowing and are going, about time he started talking about that thing. But being the sort of person who would make this kind of video, I'm also the sort of person who had to come to this fire pit, who had to perform the ritual, who would come to talk about this topic. From the outset, this has always been the destination. The video was rigged from the start. This was all inevitable. What if we took Fallout and a horse and combined them? It would be a horse unlike any horse before. Smaller, more magical, more able to haul coal through mine shafts. A pony. Fallout and a pony. Would that mean Fallout, pony, Fallout, pony, Fallout, pony, Fallout, pony, Fallout, pony, Fallout, pony, Fallout. Burning of means.
Each dialectic begins with a proposition, a thesis, which inherently contains or creates its opposite, an antithesis. Thesis and antithesis. The conflict is inevitable, but the resolution of the conflict yields something new, a synthesis, eliminating the flaws in each, leaving behind common elements and ideas.
Fallout Equestria. Fallout Equestria was how I got into Fallout. But what is Fallout Equestria? Fallout Equestria is a My Little Pony and Fallout crossover fanfiction made around 2011-2012 by K-Cat, and very well known within the Brony community. It's arguably even created its own particular community. For now, I'd like to put aside any misgivings you might have about a My Little Pony Fallout fanfiction, because It's actually really well written. It has excellent character writing, world building, and plot, and it's all around really good. The idea behind Fallout Equestria is, what if Fallout, but it happened in My Little Pony? America becomes Equestria, China becomes the new Zebra Nation, and the peppy pre-war can-do attitude translates really well. Fallout Equestria borrows parts from all the Fallout games, but it borrows the most parts in particular from Fallout 3. So what makes Fallout Equestria so interesting, especially in talking about Fallout 3, is that Fallout Equestria sort of is what Fallout 3 would be if it was well written. And also had ponies, which, as it turns out, is amazing. So, what is the story of Fallout Equestria? To give a quick blurb, Fallout Equestria is the story of Little Pip, a small nerdy lesbian who must leave her stable and face the horrors of the equestrian wasteland to find the escaped stable idol, Velvet Remedy. Little Pip will uncover the mysteries of the past and present, defeat the powers which threaten the equestrian wasteland, and put the power of friendship, as the author K-Cat described it, to the acid test. Very shonen, in other words. And now that that's done, let's begin talking about some ways in which Fallout Equestria is an improvement on Fallout 3. Fallout Equestria benefits, in a way, just by being a fanfiction, in that, being divorced from Fallout's timeline, it's a hard reboot. Everything's horses now. The old non-horse canon and paradigms don't mean squat. Hands? More like coward appendages. In being effectively a reboot rather than a sequel, Fallout Equestria manages to pull off what Fallout 3 was kinda trying to do, but couldn't. Uprooting Fallout, but still naturally holding on to its old icons and ideas. But where Fallout 3 felt like it was clinging on to these ideas with nothing to add to them, Fallout Equestria often remixes them into new and interesting forms. Take these lines from the slag Melchior in Fallout 2, describing how his people were frightened to leave their underground home. And at the start of Chapter 2, K-Cat begins with Little Pip describing the night sky after leaving the vault. Great masses of clouds rolled over the sky, but there were gaps through which soft light poured, and through those I could see that the up went on forever. Insanely, I thought of the clouds as a great net made to catch me if I ever fell into the yawning gulf above. But if I slipped through those holes, I would just fall up forever. It takes the same interesting idea, but gives it more focus and punch than it had in the original. Moving on, Three Dog and Fallout Equestria's equivalent DJ Pwn 3 are, on the surface, very similar characters. However, each is approached very differently. At first they can almost be seen as interchangeable. Both DJ Pwn 3 and Three Dog present themselves as a voice of the people. In both cases they live in a fortified position above the wasteland struggles, DJ Pwn 3 even living in the Fallout Equestria's version of ritzy Tenpenny Tower, though mixed more heavily with Vault City. And they both have 3 in their name. They're practically twins. But in character, the two diverge completely. Three Dog's existence simply was as the radio guy. When you met him, he was just the radio guy, but now giving you a quest for his radio. He was a two-dimensional character, so him trying to sell himself as a common man always felt fake. This is not the case for DJ Pwn 3. DJ Pwn 3 talks openly about their time in the wasteland and the loved one they lost before they assumed the name of DJ Pwn 3, giving them the harsh wasteland insight they claim to have. While Three Dog was always a morally imperialistic jerk trying to sell themselves as a common man on and off the radio, DJ Pwn 3 actually comes across as a multifaceted voice of the people that they're meant to narratively be, and is used to explore themes of honesty, being a DJ who at once prizes sharing the truth, and also having to keep a number of personal secrets because they could be kicked out or killed if others knew. It isn't just for characters either. Take for instance the Talons, who are in Fallout 3 just a bunch of one-dimensional bad guy mercenaries who have been hired to kill you by people for reasons, I guess. In Fallout Equestria, the Talons are mercenaries as well, and also Griffins from the Griffin lands, who have an actual code of honor they follow. And through the story, we meet both good and bad Talons. Also, that quote from earlier, showing how well the Brotherhood could be written, that quote came from Fallout Equestria. A big reveal. Here's the quote in its unedited entirety. I changed some things like ponies to people, steel rangers to Brotherhood, and dropped out the little bit about the Balefire Phoenix, so as not to spoil it all right away. I made it seem like it was Elijah because that's who the character Elder Cottage Cheese was clearly based on. There's no explicit bomb collar-esque giveaway that Cottage Cheese is specifically meant to be Elijah, but it's totally clear from just the way the character is written, and that's really cool. I mentioned Fallout Equestria's great world building earlier, and compared to Fallout games, it's actually quite different from what you'd expect. Much of what Fallout lore and world building tend to focus on are the immediate and new developments since the bombs dropped, or since the last game. How the Brotherhood came to be, how the NCR came to be, how the Legion and Caesar came to be, how we got from here to here. Then again, certain Fallout games just have societies of cave children who have all been children for 200 years, I guess. Worlds with no history at all. But regardless, an aspect which goes rather unexamined is how we went from here to here. Then again, as Fallout 2's opening says,
the details are trivial and pointless. The reasons, as always, purely human ones.
And as humans, we can fill in the gaps all too easily. This man is so close to a very important self-realization. But with ponies, that's a very different story. This to this might not seem very interesting, but how do you go from this to this? How does this prelapsarian, magical, pseudo-medieval pony world destroy itself like this? And that is a very interesting story to explore. Fallout Equestria so succinctly builds its story off of its pre-war world that, in the same way you couldn't have New Vegas without the NCR and Legion, you couldn't have Fallout Equestria without the history of its world. Now, as you've probably guessed, this is kinda a sales pitch for Fallout Equestria. And while my praise is all well and good, I came into Fallout through My Little Pony. Can the average Fallout fan really get into this sort of thing? Well, thanks to the magic of Goodreads, I found a handful of reviews which come from non-brony fans of Fallout Equestria. Came to this randomly as a Fallout fan, not knowing what to expect. Was delighted to find it's a compelling read, with a special shout out to the world building, which manages to blend two very different universes without doing terrible violence to either canon. If anyone told me I would be obsessively reading a story about magical ponies, I would have laughed really hard in response, because seriously, no way. Yet, here I am now. A must read if you're just a Fallout fan. This story is still good for you. If you're disappointed with where the Fallout franchise has gone, this story will restore your hope. I also found a very interesting case study in the form of The Folly of Man, a podcast about Fallout Equestria wherein Chris, a brony, and Robert, a simple Fallout fan, detailed Robert's journey chapter by chapter through the magically irradiated world of Fallout Equestria. It gives a quite complete outside perspective on the work, which is really valuable in recommending it. And I'd like to share a few clips of Robert, the Fallout fan, talking about the book.
Your feet aren't even wet yet. You're just
Like I
getting
said,
your shoes off.
I'm not turned off by it, but again, it's hard to. It'll take some convincing for me to understand. Like I said, it's a good Fallout story thus far. Now I know.
Boom! Shit happens in this chapter.
Yeah, this is the one.
Hell yeah! Yes, sir. So I'm ready to jump in it. For those of you.
We're going to have that, and yeah. Okay, so
You know what's funny? When you look at 45 chapters to begin with, you're like, we'll get through it eventually. And it's like 1 week at a time. No big deal. No big deal.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you're getting down to the end of it, and it's a really good story, and you're like, I want to know how this ends, and all I do is listen to podcasts all day. I got nothing but time.
So it's totally possible for a Fallout fan to get into Fallout Equestria. That said, something which the Folio of Man illustrates well is that it can get a bit confusing if you don't know anything about My Little Pony. You can follow along, but for a number of things you'll just have to shrug and say, I guess that's from the show. Fallout Equestria came out around the end of Season 1, beginning of Season 2, so while you wouldn't need to watch all 9 seasons to get caught up, that's still a whole freaking season. So the 2 episodes I'd say would be the most important to understanding Fallout Equestria would be, number 1, the very first episode, Friendship is Magic Part 1, as it'll establish the world, the princesses, and the main characters. Also Spike. And number 2, the Cutie Mark Chronicles, as it'll establish who the Cutie Mark Crusaders are, what a Cutie Mark is, Maine, Hatton, and also rock farms. Don't ask me about rock farms. Those are the 2 big ones I'd recommend, maybe Feeling Pinky Keen as well, but some other optional ones would be Friendship is Magic Part 2, Bridal Gossip, Swarm of the Century, and Winter Wrap-Up. Yes, that Winter Wrap-Up. But again, I'd say these would be on the optional side of things. Now, if you're interested in Fallout Equestria, which I hope you are, here's the part where I say, I recommend Fallout Equestria, but, yes, here's the but, Fallout Equestria discusses a lot of topics which could be quite upsetting. So here's a bit of a content warning. Firstly, Fallout Equestria's depictions of violence can be a lot more visceral than Fallout's frankly more splashy gore. There's some criticism within the Brony community as to whether so much violence is really necessary for the story, and while I wouldn't say it surpasses what's already in Fallout, it's something to keep in mind. Secondly, there are 2 different children in the book who are very definitely killed, as well as some things where the term child and killed is a bit fuzzier. Thirdly, sexual assault is mentioned and talked about a number of times, one of the later cast members even being a survivor of a violent sexual assault. And while I think it approaches the topic of being a survivor respectfully, the few details of the assault we're given are too cartoonish for the subject matter. And lastly, Fallout Equestria is well known for its depiction of drug addiction, which can feel very real at times. To give a simple difference between Fallout Equestria and Fallout's take on addiction, there's no handy pop-up which tells you, you're addicted now. That's it for the content warning, but there is one more thing. It's not a big deal, but Fallout Equestria is just a teeny tiny tad bit longer than War and Peace, which may seem like a bit of a barrier, but don't think of it as an intimidatingly long book. Think of it as a perfect epic adventure, which unlike a lot of shonen stuff, does have an ending already. If you give it a shot and find yourself liking it, you'll find that you've read it all in no time at all, and maybe even wish there was more. Plus, there are audiobook versions on YouTube. I'll link to 2 versions, the Scorch Mechanic and Craze Ramblings versions. I think that the Scorch Mechanic one is the better one by a notable degree, but the Craze Ramblings one is the more complete version. There's also an official audiobook which is being made, which seems like it'll be out sometime in the year. Links to all of those in the description. And now that we're done with the sales pitch, we should get into another important reason why I'm randomly talking about Fallout Equestria, besides because I want to. Fallout Equestria has created its own fandom of sorts, spawning artwork, music, audiobooks, podcasts, games, a role-playing game, and critically, a ton of other fanfictions. Of Fallout Equestria, I'd like to begin by saying I am by no means an expert of fanfiction, or specifically Fallout Equestria fanfiction, but there is a particular uniqueness I'd like to draw attention to. Usually in fanfiction, be it crossover, alternate universe, romance, etc., there is a distinct focus on the characters of the original work. Fanfics tend to examine what a character would do in a different set of circumstances, or if different things happened. The alternative to this norm would be for the author to create their own unique cast of characters which just so happen to share the same universe as the original, but which don't really interact with it. While I wouldn't say that 1 or 2 fics like this would be exceptional, they're certainly by no means the norm. But in Fallout Equestria fanfiction, they're all this kind of fanfiction. Or like, 99% of them are. Each fanfic with its own unique set of characters, its own setting in the Equestrian Wasteland, its own unique villains and plot. And there are a lot of these. The specifics of why this is are probably very complicated, very interesting, and would require a lot of research, which I don't want to do right now. But it's not so difficult to understand the appeal. Fallout Equestria is the sort of work which inspires you to think about the sort of stories you could tell in its world. It evokes a unique, invigorating drive to add your own story to the annals of Fallout Equestria. It's a really amazing feeling, which is hard to name. It makes you feel like there's so much more to the world that you're not seeing. Undiscovered places and stories which you could explore or create yourself.
Let it hang there. Person will be intrigued, look it up later. Maybe another character references that group or organization or religion later. Maybe it's never defined. And the player goes, I wonder what that is. I've gotten so many questions for Fallout New Vegas because Chief Hanlon, Chris Christopherson's character, says, yeah, all the veteran rangers are hunting ghosts down in Baja. And it's like every week I get 2 or 3 people saying, what is he talking about? I am never going to tell you what that is. Never, never, never. Like, something weird's going on down there. They're in Baja. That sounds mysterious. Great. Just let it go. That's a side thing. Cool. That's intriguing.
I think this is what the legacy of Fallout should be. Not what it's become, but all that it's inspired. The legacy of Fallout shouldn't be isolated and hoarded by whoever happens to have the intellectual property stick, but free to inspire others, and for those others to inspire more others. There's a lot more to say about Fallout Equestria. I haven't even touched on the weird relationship it has to Fallout 4, or the intense death of the author stuff, but for now I just want to conclude by saying this. Fallout Equestria was written by K. Cat, and K. Cat obviously really likes Fallout 3. They wrote an entire amazing fan fiction about Fallout 3, which has in turn inspired more than 1,000 other fan fictions about it. I may think that Fallout 3 is a bad game, but if something so wonderful can come out of liking Fallout 3, then I guess it can't be all bad, can it? This video, of course, was obviously inspired a lot by H. Bomber Guy's work, not just Fallout 3 is garbage. And in turn, I hope that this video will inspire someone else. I'd also really like to thank my friends Ben and Benny, because they both helped act in stuff which I ended up cutting. Sorry. And that's it. I don't really have a Patreon or anything. So, bye.